Wash your hands properly. Wash your hands regularly. Soap and water is all you need to scrub and rub naturally.
In response to COVID-19, the government of Belize has implemented strict guidelines on persons to practice social distancing to reduce the spread and risk of getting COVID-19. Practicing social distancing is when one maintains a greater than usual distance away from another person. In public health, it is a practice to prevent sick persons from coming in close contact with healthy people. Recent studies are showing that social distance of 3 feet or more decreases the exposure of COVID-19. Before these restrictions, a person with COVID-19 could infect 2.5 persons in 5 days, 406 persons in 30 days. When you put into practice measures to reduce the exposure activities by half of that one infected person, in 5 days you would possibly only infect 1.25, 30 days, 15 persons. Reduce the exposure of that infected person by 75%. In 5 days, you infect 0.625. In 30 days, 2.5 persons. Remember, the virus does not move on its own. People move it. The more space between you and others, the harder it is for the virus to spread. A health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health. If you have been directly exposed to the new coronavirus or have a history of travel in infected populated areas, it is recommended that you self-quarantine. Identify a room to be used to self-quarantine and limit contact with healthy persons. Keep away from older persons and persons who have medical conditions that affects their immune system. Monitor for any cold or flu-like symptom for up to 21 days and wash hands frequently with soap and water. If you become seriously ill, call your healthcare provider or 0800-664-2273 for guidance. A health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health.
If you have a cough or a sneeze, cover up to the right thing, please. Boys and girls, the entire family, help protect the weak country. Wash your hands properly. Wash your hands regularly. Soap and water is all you need to scrub and rub naturally. Coronavirus, seriously, it took over the world practically. Stealing lives with no remedy. You make everybody feel cautiously. Boys and girls, the entire family, help protect the weak country. Wash your hands properly. Wash your hands regularly. Soap and water is all you need to scrub and rub naturally.
In response to COVID-19, the government of Belize has implemented strict guidelines on persons to practice social distancing to reduce the spread and risk of getting COVID-19. Practicing social distancing is when one maintains a greater than usual distance away from another person. In public health, it is a practice to prevent sick persons from coming in close contact with healthy people. Recent studies are showing that social distance of 3 feet or more decreases the exposure of COVID-19. Before these restrictions, a person with COVID-19 could infect 2.5 persons in 5 days, 406 persons in 30 days. When you put into practice measures to reduce the exposure activities by half of that one infected person, in 5 days you would possibly only infect 1.25, 30 days, 15 persons. Reduce the exposure of that infected person by 75%, in 5 days you infect 0.625, in 30 days, 2.5 persons. Remember, the virus does not move on its own, people move it. The more space between you and others, the harder it is for the virus to spread. A health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health. If you have been directly exposed to the new coronavirus or have a history of travel in infected populated areas, it is recommended that you self-quarantine. Identify a room to be used to self-quarantine and limit contact with healthy persons. Keep away from older persons and persons who have medical conditions that affects their immune system. Monitor for any cold or flu-like symptom for up to 21 days and wash hands frequently with soap and water. If you become seriously ill, call your healthcare provider or 0800-664-2273 for guidance. A health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health.
If you have a cough or a sneeze, cover up to the right thing, please. Boys and girls, the entire family, help protect the weak country. Wash your hands properly. Wash your hands regularly. Soap and water is all you need to scrub and rub natural.
Welcome to today's virtual press conference by the Right Honorable Prime Minister of Belize, Dean Barrow. We will begin now, so we will now hand it over as he gives the nation an update on the measures, the new measures in dealing with COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister of Belize, Right Honorable Dean Barrow.
Thank you, Dorian. Good morning, members of the media. Good morning, Belizeans. Today marks the 31st day without anyone testing positive for the novel coronavirus. We therefore are holding steady at 18, the total number of persons to have been infected in our country. Of these, very sadly 2 have died, but all the others have recovered, so that Belize is now one of only 12 countries and territories in the entire world to be currently COVID-19 free. That is quite an achievement, and I want immediately to congratulate all Belizeans, but in particular to single out the essential service workers, all essential workers, and in particular, of course, the frontline people, the doctors, the nurses, all the medical personnel. So, while this is quite an achievement, it is not cause to declare victory. The science and the experts, including our own Dr. Manzanero, warn us of the folly, indeed the danger, of any such rashness. and the experience of other countries provides clear examples of how easily things can change. The possibility of regression, the rapidity with which a second wave could overtake us. I do not want to be a killjoy. Our relative success so far is a reason for thanksgiving, but it must not occasion carelessness or any false sense of security. Precisely that, however, seems to be occurring. Every time we announce any relaxation of our still stringent measures, we at the same time issue strong warnings. Nevertheless, too many people seem to misinterpret the easing of restrictions as a free pass to completely violate the other important prohibitions that very much remain in place. I repeat, this ordeal is by no means over, and lax or knowing avoidance of the subsisting guardrails is the surest way of taking us back to ground zero. Thus, even as I proceed now to sketch the newly agreed steps to ameliorate the lockdown, I implore our people not to see this as carte blanche for reckless or heedless behavior. So now to the changes that are being made to the SI currently in force. Last week I referred to the fact that the BTB had approached us about a domestic tourism push. Hotels had already been reopened, but questions had arisen about two things: use of hotel pools and beaches, and use of hotel restaurants. The National Oversight Committee, supported by Cabinet, has now decided that use of pools, use of the sea or rivers in the case of inland resorts, is to be permitted. As always, this is subject to social distancing. Regarding hotel restaurants, the last position was that they could only offer room service or take-out food. The new arrangements will permit eating at the restaurants so long as those restaurants have outdoor seating facilities. Again, social distancing will obtain so that tables will need to be 6 feet apart and not more than 10 persons are to be accommodated at any one time. Cabinet recognized that charges of discrimination could arise if we did not do for restaurants generally what we're doing for hotel restaurants. Accordingly, all open-air restaurants in the country will be allowed to reopen once the amended SI comes into effect. I need to stress again, though, that the social distancing prescriptions will still apply. Indeed, the National Task Force is developing today a set of written protocols to guide these restaurants on how properly to operate while social distancing. Using the same non-discrimination principle, the general public will now be able to go swimming in our rivers and seas. We can't, for local tourism purposes, encourage it at resorts, but continue to outlaw it generally. So, subject to separation, spacing, and the cap on the number of persons that can gather in any one place, Belizeans will be able, once again, to enjoy our aquatic wonders. Our Dr. Manza, as some of you know, is quite the jogger. So he certainly sympathized with his fellow aficionados that complained about the difficulties of face mask running. The medical literature bears out the thesis that the masks are not necessary for outdoor exercising. Accordingly, that requirement has been shelved, and so the Keep Fit people can now literally breathe easier. Churches can now hold services at their physical facilities, though subject to the 10-person limit. Depending on our continued anti-corona progress, we should raise that threshold within the next couple of weeks. The legal return of Belizeans, including students, that want to be repatriated is now to begin. Those wishing to come home should write to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or our embassies and consulates indicating how and when they would like to arrive. The flow will clearly have to be managed. We can't have everybody come back at once, and all returnees will be subject to a mandatory 14-day quarantine. Now, the Belizean border jumpers will continue to face criminal charges, but they too will be quarantined before their trial can even begin. They will be swabbed even before they're taken to court to be arraigned. And after arraignment, if they're given bail, they still go back into quarantine. If they're not given bail, they go back into quarantine, and at the end of the 14 days, those that have not been given bail will be transferred to the central prison. Discussion of this new phase in the easing of restrictions naturally begs the multi-million-dollar question: when will our borders reopen, and when, in particular, will the PGIA recommence operations? I'm afraid I have no comprehensive answer to give, but I can say this much: we are contemplating special and differential treatment for the PGIA, with the hope that general entry into Belize by air can begin even before entry by land and sea. Thus, a July 1st restart for international flights is the fervent hope of us all. Indeed, it has been the trigger for contingency tourism planning that is now well advanced. Unfortunately, however, we must concede the distinct possibility of a pushback. Unless, for instance, either a rapid test is available for us to screen visitors, or those visitors can produce a satisfactory passport immunity certificate, it is difficult to see how we could proceed. Otherwise, we will run unacceptable risks that could result in undoing all we have so far been able to achieve in this extended anti-coronavirus campaign. The uncertainty is most regrettable, but having to deal with moving targets is one of the core problems of the pandemic. I wind up on this first aspect of today's brief by confirming that the idea is to have the amended SI come into effect this Friday, May the 15th. The drafting is taking place even now, and the Attorney General will tomorrow, in his usual inimitable style, go through the final and authoritative version. Let me turn now to the question of the meeting that I had yesterday with the Association of Public Service Senior Managers, the Public Service Union, and the Belize National Teachers Union. We had, I thought, reached agreement subject only to ratification by the union's general membership. My CEO took copious notes, careful notes, and at the end recited for the unions GOB's final proposed position. That was what I thought they had agreed. We reduced that oral agreement to writing, and the financial secretary sent it off to the unions. Lo and behold, though, this morning we got a response from the president of the BNTU, speaking as well for the PSU, though not for the APSSM, and that response asked that some critical words be changed. Such changes would, in my view, greatly alter the spirit of the agreement and are therefore at this time not acceptable to government. The financial secretary is in the process of writing back to the two unions, so we will return to square one unless they accept in essence the language that was orally agreed yesterday. We will see how that goes. But I repeat GOB's position. It cannot be that we continue to haggle over the sacrifice we are asking of the two unions. APSSM has already agreed. The bigger picture is that their substantive salaries and job security are being pretty much guaranteed, notwithstanding the government's revenue collapse. In the private sector, no class of workers has been so exempt, and very many thousands of persons have lost their entire livelihoods. In the circumstances, what we are asking of the PSU and the BNTU is very reasonable. Too reasonable, some would say. But the idea is not to quarrel. It is to say rather that the demonstration effect of the union's acceptance or non-acceptance is a public opinion hinge issue. Regarding its core position on this matter, therefore, government is unbending. I believe that the blockage situation at the western border is now resolved, and I would be happy to expand on this as we move now to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, PM. We'll now move into the question and answer session. If you would just please state your name and the media house you represent, and then you can pose your questions to the Prime Minister on any of the issues that he addressed today. So we'll now be starting. We'll now start with Love FM. Okay, are you there?
Both, it is a tentative start date and therefore it is being explored. What I said was that the tourism community, led by the BTB, in fact, has already put some contingent plans in place in anticipation of a possible July 1st start date. But I said, and I made it plain that it was regrettable that there could not be the absolute fixity of that date. There could not be the absolute certainty about which you are asking. So I made it very clear in my introductory remarks that it may well be that we have to push back that possible July 1st start date. We clearly have to look at what continues to happen in the US. We clearly have to see how the science is developing, how the experiments are proceeding, in particular those that are looking not for the vaccine, that's clearly going to be longer in coming, but those that are looking at various forms of rapid testing, whether you're talking about antibodies testing or antigen testing. We are studying carefully what is taking place in terms of the development of a system that would permit of the conferring on peoples of this so-called immunity passport. If there is the kind of progress on these matters that we hope for, I certainly see that it is very possible, maybe even likely, that we can reach a point before July 1st that would then allow us to reopen the PGIA for July 1st. But it is not by any means a matter of certainty, and that is why I stress that the nature of this COVID-19 pandemic is such that targets are constantly moving, goalposts are constantly shifting, and in that context, it is unfortunate but necessary for us to enter the reservations that I have just articulated. I am sorry that it cannot be any more definite than that, but in terms of COVID-19, that is the nature of the beast.
Okay, and then moving on to the meeting yesterday with the unions. Could you give, I know you said that you had thought initially that you all had reached an agreement that turned out to not be the, or actually the amendments that they wanted kind of shifts what was agreed to yesterday. Could you give a general idea of what was agreed to? Because we spoke with Dean Flowers yesterday and he did explain that there was a framework that needed to be fleshed out, but that he felt that the meeting went very well and that the impact had basically been resolved.
Well, so did we. We thought that there was, in fact, a breakthrough, because I repeat that we recited at the end of the meeting, I was clear. Let me summarize where I think we have reached, and you then, that is addressing the unions, tell me whether it's accurate and whether this is what you accept. And I did that, and there was the oral acceptance. You know, I said to them yesterday that I'm sure that I would be questioned, and while I wanted to treat with some degree of confidentiality the details of what had occurred, it's very difficult. You have a right to know, the public has a right to know, and I hope that I'm not going too far, but I think your question needs an answer. We made clear that we, government, could not move from our position that the increments had to be foregone. Now, I think the difficulty arises over the meaning of foregone. We explained it in this way. From the start, we had said you lose your increments for 2020, 2021. But for any public officer, as soon as that public officer reaches retirement age, after 2021, after the fiscal year, end fiscal year 2021, for purposes of calculating your retirement benefits, we will act as though that foregone increment, we will treat it as part of the mix. indeed, because the modalities of actually achieving that can be a little bit tricky, we agreed on the formation of a small committee that would examine exactly how the calculations would take place. But I don't need to trouble you with the particulars of that. The fact is, the agreement, government's position was you forego the increments, although at the time of retirement, those increments or the foregone increment will be inputted into the formula for determining your pension benefits. The unions, or at least two of the unions, said, oh no, we only want the increments to be deferred until a time certain. Meaning, I think in one case they said 2 years. They came up with another possible formula as soon as there is a 2% GDP growth. We absolutely, government that is, refused to accept that. But I made a concession and I said, listen, increments foregone. But if at any time down the road the circumstances change, the recovery and the rebound that we hope will come as soon as possible, if it happens that we see a significant improvement in the economy, once that takes place, you, the unions, will be entitled to ask government to revisit the entire situation. And I would make the commitment from now that such a re-examination would take place. Did not commit that the re-examination would necessarily result in a restoration of the increments, but that we would re-examine is in fact logical, and to my mind was always inherent in the formula that we came up with. In the course of human affairs, there's a position that's agreed, but if things change, naturally, that change ought to precipitate some reconsideration of the position without making any promise that there would be an automatic restoration of increments. And I thought that was fine, and it struck us that they also thought that was fine. Where we're stuck now, they had been insisting, well, if there's a 2% GDP growth, or if this happens or if that happens, automatic restoration. We said no, they accepted that. That was the final position. Where we are now is that they don't want to stick by the language that had been read out at the end of the meeting. They want to change the language to say that the increments will not be foregone, they will be deferred, even though they say deferred until retirement is reached. For me, it's not a distinction without a difference. That was the crux of the matter. Words have meanings. We agreed yesterday that it was a question of foregoing the increments, and I'm afraid that government is determined to stick to that. There were some other changes they suggested. We had said to them, when circumstances change significantly, the economy improves, the unions would be entitled to ask for a re-examination. They wanted us to say, government commits to a re-examination. I don't have a problem with that, because that's only good sense and fair play, that we commit to a re-examination. So they can absolutely have that with pleasure. Understanding, to repeat what I said earlier, that committing to a re-examination is not committing to a restoration. It is merely committing to a process that would then seek to determine whether the changed circumstances were such as to be able to support a restoration of increments. So, for us, the final position is the increments are foregone, but we concede that if circumstances so warrant, a time could well come when the position would need to be re-examined. They want us to put that the increments are not foregone, they're only deferred. I'm sorry, but we cannot accept that, and that is not what was the agreement yesterday at the end of the meeting. So there you have it.
And staying in that same monies that we get each month, one to attend to their constituency and one as a personal allowance as a parliamentarian. It was brought to our attention that they did not agree to any kind of cut in their allowances. And I did ask the leader of the opposition on this, and he said that the Ministry of Finance has never proposed to them or asked them to agree to any cutback in their allowance. Could you speak on that?
Well, I certainly could, and I could offer you a mouthful, but I need to be careful. While there have been times when some of the things the People's United Party as a party has said during this crisis, I have found utterly disturbing, maybe even confounding. I have determined that I will continue to do my best to ensure that the unity approach, at least at the level of the National Oversight Committee, remains intact. So, again, I do not want to fling down the gauntlet in terms of my answer to the question you asked. So, let me limit what I have to say to this. I don't see how it can be a matter of the Ministry of Finance proposing anything to the opposition. The Ministry of Finance didn't propose the foregoing, in my own case, certainly, and I'm sorry to personalize it, but it's a fact. It wasn't the Ministry of Finance that asked me to give up my entire salary from March right through until I leave government. It wasn't the Ministry of Finance that proposed that ministers give up a month's salary and forego half of their entertainment, not entertainment, they don't get an entertainment allowance, half of their housing and telephone allowance. No, these were offers that I made, these were offers that the cabinet made. I do find it a little bit perplexing that the opposition should say, well, it is not for them in the context of the solidarity that's required, in the context of the common approach that is required, in the context of the unity effort that's required. I don't see how they can say, well, it is not for us as an opposition to offer to make sacrifices. We must first be asked by the Ministry of Finance. And I would leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. And then in the ease of restrictions, going back to that, there's one question I missed on that. In terms of cross-districting, I know you mentioned that we'll be able to support hotels and restaurants. But is that within our own district, or is cross-districting now allowed in that meeting?
Of course, well, I shouldn't say of course. Look, I'm glad you asked the question, because with these things, And that's why I said, ultimately, I leave it to the Attorney General to give you the authoritative interpretation of what he and his Solicitor General will draft. As you begin to put down on paper what the agreements are, or what the recommendations, what the decisions are of the National Oversight Committee and the Cabinet, you find that one issue is not completely dealt with by a particular formulation. So it is good that you raise the question as to cross-district movement. In my view, cross-district movement absolutely has to accompany the opening up that we are mandating with respect to hotels and hotel restaurants, but with respect also to the freedom of Belizeans to go swim in our rivers, to go swim in our seas, and as well in the context of our saying that not just restaurants at hotels, restaurants generally across the country, providing they are open-air restaurants, can as well open. So it strikes me that the cross-district movement is an inevitable feature of this, a natural accompaniment of this. So I would say absolutely there is going to be a cross-district movement. I'm just being shown a sign that tells me the AG will be on today. He had told me yesterday he would leave it until Friday, but I'm being told now that he will be on today at 3 p.m. on Ask the Experts. So I imagine the drafting has proceeded rather more quickly than either he or I expected. So please, he will go through, as usual, the new SI line by line. But to the extent that there are questions that I can answer, such as that one, please, to the rest of the media, do feel free to ask them even at this juncture.
Okay, and one final question from me here. With the ease of restrictions and trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy, could you speak regarding elections and UDP convention?
Elections and what, sorry?
The UDP leadership convention.
I have not had any time to even give any consideration to that. This is a crisis of the moment, and it is an all-consuming crisis. Clearly at the back of my mind, I must, however non-overtly, recognize that a point will come when we will have to, in the United Democratic Party, look at a convention date. In terms of the general elections, again, it is my expectation, not just my hope, that we will be sufficiently far advanced by the time the sort of last possible date for holding the general elections, if you count back from the date of the last general elections, by the time that new date comes, I expect that we will be in a position where the country will be able to hold the general elections. But again, we don't know. I repeat that the experts keep telling us, prepare for the possibility of a second wave, contemplate as well the chance that there could be a third wave. So I can't put it any higher than that. I expect we will be ready. If it turns out that we're not, then we deal with that situation at that time.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the next member of the media, Marisol.
Good morning, Marcel and Maya.
Good morning.
News. So, Prime Minister, can we start off in relation to the SOE? Parents are still being charged tuition for the last 3 months of college. Are you aware of this, and is it something you think the government would need to pronounce itself on, given that schools have not yet reopened?
I am not so aware, and I don't want to say anything without, in fact, trying to find out what the circumstances are from the Ministry of Education. So forgive me, I simply am not up to speed on that.
And in relation to tacos vendors and exercising in the evening and bundling two together?
No, not that was not the decision of either the Oversight Committee or Cabinet, that in fact the hours for exercise ought to be extended. We stopped at saying you can exercise outdoors without having to wear a mask during your exercises. And in terms of tacos vendors, no. When we spoke about open air restaurants, we were talking about restaurants that are, of course, within some enclosed or fenced or defined property. We weren't talking about street side vendors. So I'm afraid the answer to the tacos people is, I wouldn't say no, but certainly not yet. Not yet. Remember that we are doing this thing in phases. We fully recognize that the restrictions are burdensome. We think they're absolutely necessary in terms of the determination to save lives, but we will go as quickly as we can, giving due consideration to all the circumstances. So I repeat, the answer to the tacos vendors is merely not yet. This thing is under review almost, well, not almost, week by week. And even with some of the measures that we've done, take for example the churches. We're saying, and the decision with respect to the reopening of churches came out of a proposal made by the Belize Council of Churches. But we're saying, okay, 10 persons initially at physical services, which is what the council asked for. But we agreed to go back within, I think it's 2 weeks, to see if we shouldn't increase that number, which would then mean that the restriction that remains in place on social gatherings, that the limit is 10, in 2 weeks' time, there is a possibility that we might go up to 25. So there are maybe baby steps, but I think baby steps are much to be preferred to some giant leap forward that can land us into trouble. So that's what I would say on that.
With cruise line companies, have they agreed to pay for the quarantine of those returning employees?
Not yet. I'm trying to recollect exactly what Mrs. Bevans from the BTB told me. Initially, I think it was Carnival that said they would hope that the government can excuse them from bearing that burden for the quarantining of the crew members. There would be a similar response from Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. Remember that, so far as I know, Norwegian up to this point in time has not even asked. But what is important in the context of your particular question and this discussion is the following. CARICOM had a meeting, I think, on Monday or Tuesday. And the CARICOM position is that, in fact, several preconditions would have to obtain before Caribbean governments ought to accept the repatriation of Caribbean nationals that currently are crew members of the cruise lines. Most important, that position was buttressed by a legal opinion provided by the General Counsel of the CARICOM Secretariat. And that legal opinion is quite clear, having examined the common law, having examined the relevant maritime conventions, having examined the entire legal landscape dealing with this issue. The CARICOM General Counsel concluded that as a matter of law, it is the responsibility of the cruise lines to pay the quarantine costs for any Caribbean nationals that they can succeed in repatriating.
Thanks, PM. Turning to other issues, specifically the PSU, two things on that. Meaning that the possible amendment of the public service regulations is back in play.
Yes, let me explain. When we wrote to the unions via the financial secretary and raised that possibility, it was in a particular context. We were saying, listen, this is a small price for you to pay, that is, the foregoing of the increments, and we are determined that that price should be paid in the context of the larger picture. We wish for you to agree. If you don't agree, we will do it in any event. We are going to do it. And to try to put ourselves on the best possible footing for doing it, we contemplate the amendment of the public service regulations to give the minister the legal power to alter the terms and conditions. The corollary, what was implicit, and I think maybe even expressed, was that if we agree, there is no need then to amend the SI. The only possible justification for still proceeding with the amendment, if we are able to agree, and I repeat that although there was this hiccup based on their response to the FS's letter yesterday, we're still very, very close. The only possible justification then, if we agreed, for us to contemplate still amending the SI would be to give us flexibility in the event we ever reached the point that we needed to go beyond the foregoing of increments. In the event we reached the point where we had to begin talking about salary cuts or the cuts in staff numbers. Now, I repeat my own commitment to prevent that from ever happening, either substantive salary cuts or substantive cuts in the number of staff. If I then, notwithstanding an agreement on this increment matter, still proceeded to amend the SI, it strikes me that I would be signaling that I am, despite saying otherwise, preparing for this possibility of having to do salary or staff cuts. So I will say again quite clearly, once there is agreement on this issue, I would leave severely alone any notion of amending the SI. If, because as we canvassed with the unions yesterday, if things change, for example, supposing, God forbid, in the middle of this worst of all possible crises, we had a hurricane during the hurricane season. That blows things even more, no pun intended, blows things even more completely to smithereens. In that kind of a scenario, clearly everything will have to be on the table. But I don't see how the kind of crisis or the kind of extension and compounding of the current crisis that something like a hurricane would cause, I don't see how you solve that by way of legislating the austerities and the strictures that would have to come into place. Surely, in a situation like that, it's a matter of our sitting together and agreeing what is the least damaging manner in which we can proceed. And that sort of a discussion would have to be driven by the public officers themselves. So, long story short, once we can agree on this matter of the increments, there will be no need to interfere with the public service regulations and the statutory instrument governing those regulations.
PM, they've made the argument that they're not foregoing only for this year, which is what the ministers and so are doing in terms of their allowances, but that it is accumulated. It's going to be like 900 every year, even though like what you're proposing is a deferred benefit that they would be having every single year. What would be your response to that?
Oh, I don't see how one can argue with the logic of their conclusion, but the fact is that we had that well in our contemplation in insisting that nevertheless that is the sacrifice that has to be made. You can't look at it in a vacuum. You've got to look at it in the context of two things, if you'll give me a moment, Marisol. Number one, what others are going through. Nobody in the private sector is exempt. And when they that are laid off now, if they're lucky enough, are able to return to jobs, they can't say to their employers, well, you must find a way to restore all that we lost if we've been laid off for a year. With the public officers, increments apart, their substantive salary continues. Remember, that ultimately, when we finished with the three-phase increases in salary, we added $75 million annually to the wage bill, to government's wage bill, with respect to public officers. And that's apart from the 2% increment every year. So in effect, this increment is an additional salary increase in the context of what everybody else is going through. However they describe it, and I'm saying that I accept their description, it is still not nearly enough. I did something last week, but I think it is important that I do it again, coming from a different angle. Marisol, and I went through this with them yesterday. Look at the budget book. Look at the allocations. The budgeted allocations for 2020-2021 are as follows. Recurrent revenues are projected, or were projected. We'll have to, at some stage, 3 or 4 months from now, go and do a whole new budget. But for now, recurrent revenues are projected at $1,206 million. Emoluments and pensions, salaries, those are $688 million. Goods and services, $299 million. Debt service, interest and principal, $230 million. So the total spending, of which the biggest line is the $688 million for salaries, the total spending before any capital expenditure is $1,217 million. The optimistic projections are for government to lose 30% of its recurrent revenue. So instead of the 1,206,000,000, we would collect no more than 844 million. That immediately gives you a deficit of 373 million. We talked about cost savings, other measures, but the only scope for saving would be with respect to the goods and services line, which represents 299 million. And we can't cut that to the bone because you need to continue to operate, to collect the little taxes that are still coming in, to provide for healthcare. You asked about education, or somebody asked about education, to provide for education, to provide for security and all that. But if you cut that goods and services line by 25%, that would yield a savings of 75 million, which would still leave you with a deficit of 298 million. Let's assume further that we don't pay the super bond, and I'm not saying there are people who have been at me internationally wanting to pull my tongue as to what we will do with the super bond. I don't think that's how you negotiate that sort of thing. But let's assume, just for purposes of this argument, that you suspended payment of the super bond amounts. That would be another 52 million that you're saving. But you still are then left, after the 25% cut from goods and services, after completely reneging on the super bond payments, you still would be left with a remaining deficit of $246 million. The only way you can bring that figure or those figures into alignment is if you cut 36% from the emoluments and pensions line. If you took away 36% from the salaries of the public officers, notwithstanding the irrefutable, the ineluctable logic of those figures, I have said to the public officers, I have said to the country, I have said to the world, and I've gotten some stick for it from the private sector, that it is my determination to ensure that not one penny will be cut from the substantive salaries of the public officers, and not one public officer will lose his or her job. Man, in the context of that larger picture, I don't care how you slice the foregoing of the increment. That is a very small price to pay, and I believe that notwithstanding the confusion over deferral and foregoing, the unions are recognizing of that untrammeled, incontrovertible fact of life, figures, and finances.
Okay, thank you, Marisol. Unfortunately, her computer went down, so we'll now move on to another media member.
But I hope others were able to hear people.
Yes,
because that's very important.
But she had another question, but she'll pass on those questions. Jules Vasquez, you're up next. Jules, you start? Can you unmute your mic, please, Jules?
My bad. Okay, good morning. Jules Vasquez here from Channel 7. First off, quickly, congratulations to the press office for finally fixing it so that we can all be in the same time frame without a lag. Good job, guys. Quickly, if we can move on, Mr. Prime Minister, the practical dimensions of repatriation. I know this is something that you have been much hectored about, as have I, because we have so many Belizeans, in Europe, in Asia, in Cuba. We know the student. Would you speak of this insofar as obviously the only airport that probably remains open is in Cancun. I don't imagine the government will be chartering repatriation flights, as we see other large countries doing, or as we see large countries doing.
Sorry, I should have interrupted you. Forgive me. I'm sorry.
No, no, no problem. So, in lieu of any chartered flights, would you urge those many Belizeans out there in the hinterlands? Would you urge them to fly to Cancun?
One of the few viable practical options. You know that from time to time, flights have come from the States for purposes of repatriating U.S. nationals from North America, from the States and from Canada, for the purposes of repatriating Canadian nationals, U.S. nationals. It may be that in that context, we can change the protocol that governs those flights. Protocol is that you come in completely empty. When you get here, not even the crew can disembark. It's for the sole purpose of having the Canadian and US nationals then board those flights. The plane turns right around, or the planes turn right around, and they go back. If that sort of thing is still continuing, it may well be that the airlines would be agreeable to giving space to Belizeans on those flights. It may well be that the number of Belizeans could be such that special charter flights could be put on by the airlines that Belizeans would be able to pay for without taxing the government any further. But I would concede that as things now stand, the Mexico route via Cancun would appear to be what is most in play. That is why we're very careful in saying, look, you can come, but let's do a kind of census. Let us have you indicate who you are, when it is that you want to come, and how, by what route you expect to come, so that we can then say, all right, we will initially accept a group of 50 perhaps, and the health people and those that are in charge of logistics will better advise us. Remember, this is a work in progress, but we will determine then how many at any given time we can accept, bearing two factors in mind. Number one, when you come, you will have to be quarantined, and you don't get out of that quarantine for 14 days, at which point you will be tested, and it is only if you test negative that you are going to be released. But it means for 14 days, as it were, all the quarantine space will be occupied. So it's a kind of relay situation. And that is why I am saying that while they can begin to come, they will come by way of a phased flow that we will need to control. The question of the cruise lines, though, caused us to think in these terms. For the cruise ship passengers, for the crew members, the Belizean crew members that Royal Caribbean and Carnival wanted to repatriate, we said to them, listen, you should not have to wait on government to get the public quarantine facilities up and running, because as that legal opinion from CARICOM has made clear, it is your financial responsibility to pay for the quarantining of the crew members that you wish to repatriate. So we had the BTB go around and speak to hotels to see which hotels would be amenable to, in fact, accepting returning Belizeans for quarantine purposes. It would mean, of course, that there would be a fee. You would have to pay the hotels for the accommodation, for the 3 meals per day. Government would then maybe put a policeman or two 24/7 at those hotel premises, just to try to ensure that there is no breaking of the quarantine. But what we're saying to the cruise lines about crew members would hold generally for Belizeans. We don't want to discriminate, but if you, as a would-be returnee, can actually pay for your quarantine stay in some hotel/guest house facility, then you can presumably come in advance of others who say, look, I simply can't pay. At the end of the day, those others will have to be allowed to come nevertheless, but at a cost to the government. And cost apart, it will take us some little time to be able to staff all the quarantine facilities countrywide. What we want to do is, if you come, we've just been talking, Jules, about the fact that by and large you'll most likely be coming through Mexico. But we don't want to keep you quarantined in Curacao, the first point that you reach when you re-enter. If you're from Cayo, we want to give you an escort to Cayo so that you can quarantine in Cayo closer to your family. But again, unless we rely on the hotel or guest house facilities to help with quarantine space, you can see that it will be a long drawn out process. So we are in fact encouraging those that can pay to help us. We would then, to repeat, as it were, contract the services of the various hotels and guest houses, and those that are prepared to pay can come, as it were, immediately, because they don't have to wait until we can get up to speed on this question of identifying and outfitting, both physically in terms of any refurbishment that might be needed, but staff-wise as well. They wouldn't have to wait until we complete that long process of identifying sufficient quarantine space in each and every single district.
One thing immediately of the Mennonites from Shipyard who are in Chetumal for some time now, over a month, I believe. I would expect that you've been apprised of this case. I know they've written to the Attorney General. Just using that as an example, they are in Chetumal for, I believe, 6 weeks, and they would like to come back. Would they be allowed back as soon as quarantine arrangements can be worked out?
In other words, the SI goes into effect on Friday. They, as far as I'm concerned, could come in that same Friday or the following day, especially if they, I don't want to hear about self-quarantining, because that gets us into trouble. Now, there are circumstances when people are coming back because they've had to go to Mexico or wherever for medical attention. And let's talk about the case of somebody who is a cancer patient. When that person comes back, that person is to be quarantined, but at home. You can't put somebody who has to be cared for as a cancer patient in a regular quarantine facility. But I don't think any of the group of Mennonites that you're talking about falls into that category. So they can, I believe and hope, pay for quarantine facilities as close to where they actually reside as possible. Subject to that, I repeat, there is in my mind no reason why they cannot now be let in as soon as the arrangements can be made to screen them at the border, to escort them to the quarantine facilities, as soon as those arrangements can be put in place, which cannot take longer than a day or so.
Sir, you spoke about a viral passport when tourism, international tourism resumes. But isn't that problematic insofar as immediately undermined by the fact that you may have gotten a negative COVID rating or antibodies, whatever, but then you have to report on a plane which has its own specific exposure risks. Is this so-called viral passport sufficient without the backup of a test on arrival?
I spoke to both things, but I believe, Jules, that in the current climate, neither one, by itself, the two together are not yet satisfactory. In terms of the rapid test, there clearly is likely to be an improvement to the development process for those rapid kits. In terms of the immunity passport, the objective difficulties are rather more severe. But what I wanted to say was that ultimately it is all part and parcel of the balancing act that we have to do. To use this phrase that I elsewhere saw employed, we are trying to do two things: save lives and safeguard livelihoods. Save lives and safeguard the economy. Take the situation at the border, which has now been resolved. It has resolved in a way that contains some inherent risks. So, coming back to the question of the immunity passport, the decision, if that alone is in play, the decision will still have to be taken. As of now, I can tell you, I believe the decision would be no. But by July 1st, the decision would have to be taken. We know it is not a fail-safe for the reasons that you have so clearly outlined. But are we at a point where we so desperately need to reopen the tourism industry that we're prepared to run some degree of risk? Those like yourself who are capable of all sorts of algorithms and all that kind of fine exercise would have to say, well, your risks in terms of the possibility roughly of those that could come in and afterwards be found to be positive and infect people would amount to X possible number. All that sort of equation construction would have to be done, and then the decision would be taken as to whether the risk, because risk there will be, is acceptable. I think that's what I'm saying, and I don't see that I can go beyond that.
Okay, and then, sir, speaking on the matter of public finances, we know that obviously it's MFA reports every year that the public sector spending has to be reined in, and we know that the way just illustrated is a huge part of that. In your budget presentation, you said that the wage bill was $540 million. You just said just now it's $688 million, if I understand you, with pensions. Obviously, we know that, and it is a default from you took office in 2008. At some point, we know that the wage bill is a cut that will have to be bailed. If you who is retiring and leaving electoral politics, if you are unable to do it, obviously no one who is a going concern will ever do it. Is there any consideration? And I am not proposing, but I know that the multilateral inevitably will do so. That somebody at some point has to say, well, the government has to contemplate retrenchment or some adjustment of its non-contributory pension scheme. Is this within the realm of contemplation? That's number one. Number two, if you could simply address the Moody's downgrade for Belize, saying that we probably won't be able to make the interest payment on the super bond. Thanks.
Well, that's dealing with that last one first. That's why I was careful to say, I'm going over the numbers, that if we assume a non-payment of the super bond, then you arrive at a particular situation. But I insisted that we only made that assumption for the purpose of the exercise, that I am not to be taken as hereby declaring that we will not, in fact, make those payments. I think, Jules, that we all are aware of what the climate is. We know that there are multiple calls for some kind of debt standstills. Some of those calls have been acted upon, but only with respect to the poorest of the poor, the IDA countries, those that are part of the International Development Association. And the qualification for getting into that particular club is that, of course, your GDP or your per capita GDP is in the toilet, so middle income, so-called middle income countries are excluded. We don't think that's fair, but that's another story. Fact is, however it is pitched, there is this now, in my view, deafening cry on the part of the international financial sector, on the part of the multilaterals, for some kind of debt relief, some kind of debt standstill, some kind of possible debt forgiveness to take place. We are naturally anxiously following this discussion. The next super bond payment is due in August. We want to see where this discussion will lead before we take a position and begin some sort of a conversation with our bondholders. I don't want to serve notice on them of any particular course of action we might be contemplating via a press conference. I don't think it's fair to them. I don't think it's the professional thing to do. But as I may have said to you already, when you had asked me a similar question, on the other hand, there are those who would say the writing is very clearly on the wall. And then as to your first question, well, if I wanted to take the view that because my departure from electoral politics is both inevitable and imminent, depending on how you describe imminent, I could not worry about various things. I would then cop out of this whole contretemps, if you will, with the unions. I could say, what does it matter if I agree with you that in 2 years' time you get it back? I won't be here for you to collect it from, but I don't think that's responsible. I don't think that's fair. I as long as I'm here, I believe I must act in a certain way. And so it is the same kind of analysis I bring to bear on this question of the salaries which the IFIs, and in particular the IMF, which the IFIs say are unsustainable. I therefore am not going to take the attitude that, well, let me be, if you will, the sacrificial lamb because I have nothing to lose politically, and let me say, let's start to cut. No. No, I think that it is part of my charge, as long as I'm sitting where I am, to try to protect the public officers for as long as possible. But I will say this, And that is what I also told them yesterday. I will hold on as long as I can, but a day of reckoning is coming. All this business about or quibbling over when and if the economy will recover and the extent of such recovery, that's not idle, but any sense of serious optimism about a strong early recovery, in my mind, is entirely misplaced. Look, all the wealthy, developed nations are taking a licking. All the projections are that this is worse in the US than the Great Depression. Why would we fool ourselves? We don't want to kill hope, but why would we fool ourselves into thinking that there will be some kind of springing back with respect to our economy? All that so as to say that ultimately, and maybe that is the solution, ultimately, as part of our efforts at recovery, who comes next, in my view, will more likely than not have to talk to the IMF. Who comes next will have to talk to the IFIs generally. Who comes next will need assistance, serious funding assistance. What we are hoping to get from the IFIs now, those are holding funds. Those are funds to help us with the food assistance program, with the unemployment relief program, with help for the farmers in agriculture. Those have nothing to do with the kinds of structural changes that will be necessary for the economy and the fiscal position and public finances to recover. We will need help for that recovery in public finances. And where else are we going to turn? Any chance of further commercial borrowing is shot. So we will have to go to these people, and they will extract their pound of flesh. And maybe that's not even the right way to frame it. It's a kind of old automatic. They won't give you the assistance that you require, except they say, you will no longer be able to proceed as though you are heedless to what we have been telling you for years and years and years.
As you have done.
A conditionality or a condition for the assistance that you will need is in fact pension reform, is in fact the trimming of the wage bill, is in fact retrenchment in the public sector. No. If I were still in play, I could sit here and tell you I would find a way to dodge that. But when you don't have to face the music, you can pretend to be the most skillful dancer in the world, you know. Bottom line is, I grieve for my poor Belize, and I certainly extend my sympathy from now to those that will have to deal with that particular problem, because Jews, you are absolutely right. There is no way we will be able to postpone for any period, any extended period beyond this crisis, coming to terms with the demands of the IMF and the other IFIs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jules. We'll now turn to Paul Lopez plus TV.
PM, Paul Lopez plus TV. My first question, let's take it to the border in West. Would you be able to give us an update on the situation over there at the western border? We understand that the matter was resolved with the protest. If so, could you explain what was the main issue there and was resolved?
I think the crisis was brought on by the fact that the ministry administrator of immigration received reports as to, in one case, or on one day last week, something like 46 Guatemalans coming in with trucks and of course the drivers of those trucks and other personnel into our country, and going as far south as Stanquin, in one case to deliver packing crates, I believe, for the banana industry. Now, we all know that from time to time there will be slippages, but that was altogether too much. And so the Immigration Department decided that this had to stop and began insisting that the protocols that had been agreed, though clearly not observed, should now rule. That is, you're bringing in cargo from Guatemala. There's a point, a sort of exchange point, at which, if you're talking about cargo in trailers, the trailers can be unhitched from the Guatemalan vehicles and rehitched to Belizean vehicles with Belizean drivers, and they're the ones that should bring in the cargo. There is one case, I won't call the individual's name, but that particular person hit on the bright idea of licensing trucks that he owned in both Guatemala and Belize. So when his cargo was coming in from Guatemala and he reached that transfer point, all he did was to change the license plates of the vehicle, took off the Guatemalan plates and put on the Belizean plates. Well, there's no way you can argue against that sort of creativity and that sort of ingenuity. The trucks were properly licensed in Belize, insured, everything. But there was the question of those trucks still being driven by Guatemalan drivers. Immigration said that must stop. And that was agreed to by that particular importer, and all the other traffic, apart from the question of corn, was free to go. The bridge, though, was blocked. The border crossing was blocked by those Guatemalans that were interested in, and in fact were already, I think, part of the purchase of corn from the Mennonites in Spanish Lookout. What immigration proposed, they insisted, the Guatemalans, that they must come in with their trucks and their personnel, go straight through to Spanish Lookout, purchase their corn, load their corn in Spanish Lookout, and then turn around and go back home. Immigration first said, no, that can't happen. You must, like, as with other cargo, you must arrange for some kind of transfer. So it would have meant that the Mennonites would have had to bring the corn to the border and transfer the corn from Belizean trucks or from Belizean containers to Guatemalan trucks and Guatemalan containers. That ran up hard, though, against one issue. It was, from what I understood, it could have been done as a matter of logistics. But the Guatemalans said no, they purchased corn on a spot basis for this reason. They, according to them, need to make sure, number one, that the quality of corn that they're getting is satisfactory. So they needed to examine the corn before it was loaded. They needed to make sure that the quantity of corn that they were getting would be exactly what they were paying for. And they were saying the only way of ensuring that their interests were satisfied was for them to go to Spanish Lookout, examine the corn, agree the price then and there, depending, they said even the price depended on the quality of corn you were getting. And so they insisted, go to Spanish Lookout and do the purchasing and the loading into their vehicles at that point. It took us a while, or a day or so, to reconcile ourselves to that position, because it meant that technically we were breaching the SI. Guatemalan trucks and Guatemalan drivers, accompanied by the purchaser or purchasers, would be coming into our country and going to Spanish Lookout. But there are no perfect solutions, and unlike the situation with the beef, with the cattle, where that was an illegal trade, the corn trade is legal, and we know that the Mennonites had already suffered in terms of the cessation of the cattle exports. And so we felt, listen, their trucks would be sprayed at the border, their personnel would be screened, would be checked. I don't know if there's such a thing as spraying personnel. I don't want to get like President Trump, but whatever, as much as could be done by the health authorities would be done, and then the trucks would be escorted by customs to make sure that no hanky-panky would take place at the point of loading, but subject to those cautions or precautionary measures. It was thought so as not to have the Mennonites lose the corn market. We would run the risk. I talked to Jules earlier about the need to do the balancing act. So we decided we would run the risk and have those people, allow those people to go to Spanish Lookout under escort and complete their transactions there.
All right. As for my second question, and thank you for your clear response. There is the domestic tourism, and thank you for your pump back some blood back into the veins of the economy per se. Domestic PM, some will argue that pump every single Belizean back into the veins of the economy per se. Trying times. PM, some will argue that every single Belizean tourism is this a foreseeable challenge in this area, and how do we ensure that these tourism is this a foreseeable challenge in this area, and how do we ensure that
you're right that consumption has gone way down, people don't have money. But
the key in this plan
request for us to try to push domestic tourism came from the BTB, or came from the industry itself via the BTB. And one of the first things the BTB said to us was that if we can look at a May 15th start date, the hotels would begin to advertise special packages, special low rates for Belizeans as a way of trying to get as much traffic as possible. But your point is absolutely irrebuttable. It's going to be nothing like what is needed to help to resuscitate the industry. We're operating on the principle that a little, even a very little, is better than nothing at all.
All right, and as for my next question, as you rightly alluded to earlier, every time we see a laxing in measures, we see increased arrests. Every time we see allowing people to walk measures, we see increased arrests and pools and enjoy action. That we're allowing I could only imagine that the policing will swim the rivers, more of a complex and enjoy accommodation. Are we prepared to only imagine that policing will become more of a harder, laxing measures? Are we prepared to understand that the curfew is still in effect with these since the SOE is still in effect measures? And B, are we to understand that the curfew is still in effect with since the SOE is still in effect?
Of my intervention, and throughout, I tried to intersperse what I was saying with these appeals to people. It can't rely on just the policing alone. We have to be responsible enough to realize that so far we have done exceptionally well, but that can be jeopardized and all the progress can disappear in a heartbeat. So if that happens, it's not just the results in terms of the return of the virus and all the health difficulties that go with that. It is that we'll have to go right back to a complete lockdown and start all over again. So I have to continue to implore our people, please recognize how absolutely monumental the dangers of a return to exactly where we started from are, how monumental those dangers are, and please help us and help yourselves. Please do your best to act within the confines and the constraints of those restrictions that are still in place. That's as much as we can do, because even though clearly there is a need for increased surveillance, monitoring and policing, we will never be able completely, from the point of view of law enforcement, to put the kind of lid on loose behavior that we would want to see. So again, the appeal to the public has got to be made, has got to be underlined at every possible juncture.
Now finally for me, PM, we work being done in the domestic tourism area, but my question for me, follow-up to that is, what are those plans for further work being done in the domestic tourism area, revitalization for small businesses, and what are entrepreneurs that took a hit during the most stringent economic revitalization for small businesses and entrepreneurs that took a hit during the most stringent times? I know the recent opposition had recommended $1 million stimulus interest during one of the more recent House meetings. Considerations are being made. Is there a plan or low interest business loans? During the last press considerations are being made? Is there a plan or reacting during the last press conference?
I don't know how anybody could say we're acting in a reactive mode. All the initiatives of this government, of the country, in terms of unemployment relief, in terms of the food rollout, in terms of the health sector response to the pandemic, I think those are very much to be commended. I may have said on the last occasion, and if I don't, I will say so now, there is a group which is a subset of the National Task Force. We have the National Oversight Committee, but remember we also have a National Task Force that is chaired by CEO Judith Alpuche and co-chaired by Dr. Daisy Mendez Garcia, or Garcia Mendez. I hope she'll forgive me if I have it the wrong way around. That National Task Force, for example, they're the ones that prepare the protocols to guide hotels as we, or restaurants, as we reopen those restaurants that can cater for outside dining. They have formed a subcommittee of that National Task Force that is looking expressly and precisely at business continuity plans, how you get things back up and running. And the membership of that committee, apart from the usual suspects, now has been added to by the presence of the accountant, Mr. Sanchez. Audrey, help me. Jack, how you pronounce his? The gentleman from Sanchez and Burrell, who is also a member of, I think, the executive committee of the Chamber of Commerce. He's there. The economic czars have been asked to assist. At our last meeting, Giacomo? Right. The last meeting of the National Oversight Committee received a request from Dr. Sansores, who is the NTUCB representative on the National Oversight Committee, for the NTUCB to also have a representative on that business continuity or economic recovery subcommittee, and that was agreed. So these people are, it's a huge subject, and these people are working on concrete plans which will be presented to the nation as soon as the exercise is finished. With respect to the leader of the opposition's call for that stimulus package, this is why I keep saying to the unions that when I go and I borrow from the central bank in order to keep them whole, I am taking away that money from other purposes that could help larger segments of the society. The leader of the opposition's call for a stimulus package is perfectly in order, but the money can only come from one place, from the central bank. And if I have to borrow all from the central bank to keep the public sector whole, you see the difficulty that it causes. I am hoping that the crisis won't last as long as we fear, or even if it lasts longer than we hope, that it won't be as pronounced as we go forward as it is now. In which case, my borrowings for salary purposes could lessen if, as well, people start going back to work. We won't have to spend as much on the unemployment relief program as we had anticipated. If there are savings on both those fronts, then those savings, or I can't call them savings, the smaller degree of borrowings, what is not borrowed for the purposes that we have already identified, could then be used to fund to some degree the kind of stimulus package that is being called for, because that such a package is absolutely desirable and indeed necessary, is something that cannot be argued against.
So are we to assume that the sub is already in operation, that they are already working?
Absolutely.
So are we to assume that allow me to ask one final question that be remiss of me to ask, is already in operation, that they are students being allowed to return back into Belize? Will the government, in terms of provide some sort of students being allowed to return back into Belize, will the government be able to provide some sort of financial support to them for quarantine expenses?
Completely shut off the borders. That was precisely the position. We had said that Belizeans can come home on the basis of accepting that they're to be quarantined at their own expense. That is going to be the norm for this segment of repatriation, but of course, if there are people, such as students, who can show that neither they nor their guardians or parents can afford the expenses of quarantine, government will simply have to foot the bill.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Paul. We'll now move on to Hippolito Novello from Channel 5.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Hippolito from Channel 5. My first question would have to be related to the Paul's first question in terms of the economy and specifically the tourism industry. We know that we're trying to push domestic tourism to revive the economy here in Belize. Our tourism industry accounts for about 40% of GDP. What's the plan in order to revive tourism, especially when we have like the United States that's going on? We're becoming the epicenter of this deadly coronavirus. What would be the plan in terms of international tourists?
Rapid test. That would be the key, one key certainly, to a reopening. If we can't, but there's some kind of immunity passport that tourists can bring with them, and the question of whether a so-called immunity passport is really effective looms large. There is division of opinion. I made the point, though, that we may well end up in a situation where we have to decide, well, maybe it's not foolproof, but nothing is foolproof. So will we consider the risks of accepting an immunity passport, knowing that it is not a fail-safe? Will we consider that sort of a risk acceptable? Those are the questions with which we grapple as we decide when, in particular, as we try to make sure that there is a fixed date on which we can declare the PGIA open to international travelers.
The tourism industry is a huge foreign exchange. What's the level of our foreign exchange?
I don't know exactly where we are now. It changes from moment to moment. We're certainly below, I would hazard, and I think the last report the central bank showed me confirmed that we're certainly below the 3 months import cover that ought to be the benchmark. We're not yet, though, at a point where the central bank has to step in and ration the foreign exchange disbursements. The commercial banks are still, in fact, serving their customers who need foreign exchange to continue importing. I believe, though, that between the commercial banks and the central bank, there is a kind of priority list that has been developed. But the short answer to your question is, while we're certainly not where we would like to be or ought to be in the middle of a pandemic, we are still managing up to this point in time.
Prime Minister, what is the status of the unemployment relief program? Is it expected that the entire $75 million borrowed from the central bank would, because the calculations showed that it would allow for just about 80,000 beneficiaries, but over 15,000, I believe, have been disallowed from benefiting from the program.
Remember, that's what I said to you just a little bit earlier, that if we, for whatever reason, because the crisis does not last as long as we had originally anticipated, or it is not as pronounced as we had originally anticipated, perhaps we don't have to spend that entire 75 million, and whatever we don't spend on unemployment relief could become available to constitute a part of the stimulus package that, of course, we would dearly like to offer as the economy reopens. I don't think that we will spend the entire 75 million. Remember, though, that I've already moved 10 million of the 75 to send across to Human Development for the rollout of the food assistance program. I expect to put it back because the OFID people have promised to reimburse me for that. Bottom line, your question is to be answered in the way I have just tried to answer it. Providing, and I think this will turn out to be the case, providing we don't have to spend all of the 75 million on unemployment relief, whatever is not spent can go towards helping to provide a stimulus package for economic recovery.
Perfect. What is the update in terms of the IFS loans? How much has the country, the government received so far in those loans?
From the IFIs?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely nothing. Remember, I set out that I enumerated the various lines we were pursuing and had been promised. But in every single case, we were given a timeline. The nearest, the closest disbursement date is from the IDB, and that's for the 6.2 million US dollars that's supposed to come for assistance to the health sector, and we've been given the date of 28th May as the date on which the IDB board is expected to sign off finally and disbursements can begin. So let's say end of May, first day of June, certainly for the start of the disbursement of the 6.2 million US dollars. The IDB is supposed also to provide another 12 million. And remember, these monies are not new monies. These are all monies that have already been approved for various in-country programs that are simply being reallocated. But there's another 12 million US dollars that the IDB is saying we could use either for a sort of expanded boost program or for assistance with the unemployment relief if that continues longer than we anticipate. But that's not going to come, they make clear, before at the earliest the middle of June. We are pursuing the line from the World Bank, which again is a reallocation of some 21 million US dollars from the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Project. Of that 21 million US dollars, 8 million is to go to the farmers, especially the small farmers, by way of monies in their pocket, that type of relief. And the balance is again to assist with giving more to those persons that are on the boost program and putting more persons on the boost program. But again, that's not going to come before earlier than the middle of June. The last two lines, also from the World Bank, are from programs that have not yet been approved by their board. We had talked to them when they were last in country about $25 million for agriculture. This is not no monies in pocket relief, but for an agriculture project that would help the country to do better by way of irrigation and various other things. That can't come before, at the very earliest, July, because that is new money. That's not yet been approved by the board of directors. And finally, there's another $25 million US line from the World Bank for social protection. That again would give us some latitude in terms of using the funds or portions of the funds to assist with boost, to assist with food rollout, that kind of thing. But also that is still to go to the board of directors for final approval, so you're not looking at that before something like the end of July or possibly even August. So I have no doubt that these people are serious, that the monies will come, but I always say to Tina Kroll, while the grass to grow, the horse to starve. Nevertheless, we wait and hope that at our continued and insistent urgings, they can perhaps give us something of a fast track in terms of the disbursement of those monies.
Thank you. On my last topic would have the Prime Minister, the issue with the PSU, the BNT, and PSSM, specifically with
I told you the APSSM is agreed.
Yes, understood. But specifically to the PSU, the first Vice President, Mr. Flowers, had mentioned the cost-saving measures. In the years the PSU had been employing on the government on these cost-saving measures. He says that the government ignored those measures in terms simply cost saving for every ministry. He pointed out on the Ministry of Housing, I believe, on Open Your Eyes earlier this week, that the Ministry of Housing hasn't built house in the past 10 years. And in home, the CEO would have saved at least $100,000, he asserted. How do you respond?
No, I don't want to get personal. I was going to say I think that's silly, but let me not say that. I think that's absolutely divorced from reality. The Ministry of Housing hasn't built a house because when we did have money for housing, remember that we got back from Venezuela after it had been diverted, the housing or the houses that were built by the private sector, although under the stewardship of the Ministry of Housing. There is still stuff that the Ministry of Housing does, and maybe you can see that as a cost saving, that the Ministry of Housing is not given any big budget to construct low-income houses for people. But generally, on this question of cost savings, we talked about that yesterday, and I had the opportunity to see the proposals, the memorandum containing the proposals of the unions, and as I told them, some of the proposals struck me as perfectly in order, and it was agreed that indeed some effort would be made at implementation of some of the proposals. But Mr. Novello, I want to remind you again of what I said. That should be done, and any little bit helps. But sir, at the very most, even if you were able to achieve something like a savings of 25% under the line from which the cost savings would come, you are still left with a deficit of $298 million. So let us not fool ourselves. Let us not try to have anyone suggest and get away with it that we would not be where we are, or we could get out of where we are by effecting cost savings. There is no cost savings that can be possible to the extent that would relieve us of more than, as I said, this small savings of $75 million, not small generally, but in the context of where we are, small savings of $75 million, leaving us with a deficit of basically $300 million. Don't let us misunderstand what is happening. And what is happening to us is happening to every country. There's no point talking about what you could have done in the past, what was not done at any particular juncture. The richest countries in the world are catching their tail because this is a pandemic. This is a once in a lifetime. I don't want to say millennium because there have been plagues before, but once in a lifetime event that is wiping out economies all over the world, from the strongest to the weakest. So indeed, let us not just sit on our hands and make no effort to see how we can help ourselves, but on the other hand, let us not be unrealistic and run away with any idea that we can cut to an extent that will get us out of the hole. The only way, I repeat, you can bring the finances back into alignment is if you cut salaries and cut staff. And I also repeat, I am not prepared to do that.
Mr. Prime Minister, as you rightly said, every little bit counts. I think the public was surprised that the ministers were giving up their phone allowance of $1,000 monthly. I believe they weren't surprised they were giving up. They were surprised that they were receiving $1,000 monthly for phone allowance. Some people are saying that's exorbitant.
No, man, wrong. Don't get it wrong. Housing and phone allowance. That's a combined amount. Housing and phone allowance. All right.
Thank you, Hippolito. We'll now move on to CTV3. Cami, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Good afternoon. My question is in relation to employees of the Corozal Commercial Free Zone and the casino. In sight of the numbers that keep increasing over in the Mexican side, is there any plan for these employees, bearing in mind that they probably will be the last ones to be allowed to go back to work? I know that we have the COVID relief unemployment assistance and the food packages, but some of them are saying they haven't received any type of assistance as yet. Is there any concern towards these employees?
There's a concern, and if they haven't received their assistance, something is wrong. Clearly, we talked about the fact that bogus applications have now helped to slow the approval process. But that does not in any way excuse any lack of effort to try to get to those people that you've identified, those that are free zone workers, to ensure that once they qualify, they can demonstrate that they have lost their employment, to ensure that they get their unemployment relief. So again, let's use this opportunity to say to the economic czars and to the members of the processing committee that there is still this cry from the free zone workers that too many of them are yet to receive their unemployment relief assistance.
And if needed, can they get the guarantee from you as Prime Minister that their assistance can be received further on than the 3 months that it's made available for now?
That Dr. Barnett said it was less than under 200 persons of all the applicants, only 200, less than 200 had not yet received their allocation, and that was being, they were trying to remedy that as quickly as possible.
Okay. Now, my next question, Prime Minister, is in relation to municipalities. I know that you were asked about them the last time that you held the press conference, but I do understand that they are asking government two things. One, they are asking if government at this point in time could offer a temporary bank guarantee on an overdraft that they want to obtain. They are asked to apply, but they need to get a guarantee. In sight that town councils don't have any type of collateral, no land, they are asking government to be a backup for them. Is this something that government would be willing to do to get this overdraft going?
It's not a matter that they have no collateral, you know. It's a matter that they do need the approval of the Ministry of Finance to make loan arrangements at commercial banks. It is also that indeed, even if they could find collateral and get the approval of the Ministry of Finance, which they would get right away, they don't want to approach the banks on that basis, or they have approached the banks and they have not approached the banks on that basis. They have approached the banks on the basis that government is to guarantee their overdraft. I'm very sorry, but we can't. You're talking about overdraft facilities. It's not even a long-term loan that with some grace period that we could perhaps have a hope of seeing the municipalities begin to repay on themselves and so sparing government from having to find money that it does not have and cannot find. You're talking about overdraft facilities, a continuing thing. Where on earth? That's as good as asking government to find the money and give it to them. And we wish we could, but we can't. I'm sorry.
Prime Minister, is for at least for the rest of the fiscal year, if GOB would consider offering municipalities duty-free fuel or reduction in fuel prices. Would this be considered then?
No, ma'am. And let me tell you why. I've just gone through the figures and the way revenues are collapsing. One of the most certain of our revenue sources is the tax on fuel. Of course, collections have also gone down tremendously, even in that regard, because the volume of fuel that is being consumed has dropped precipitously. But since we have to pay public officers, we have to operate the government, we have to provide for health, we have to provide for education, we have to provide for security, we cannot give up even the little that is remaining to us in terms of revenue collection. So again, I am very sorry. Municipalities have their obligations. They serve a number of persons. The government's constituency is the entire country, and we cannot, as it were, foreclose on our responsibility. And if indeed we gave up a goodly portion of the little that we still are able to collect on fuel, we would be doing just that. So I apologize, but we cannot do it.
Sir, finally for me, can you provide us with an update on the exportation of cattle to Guatemala and to Mexico? Any update on that? And what about the exportation of cattle to St. Vincent? I believe that was something that government was looking into. I think it was mentioned by you and by the Minister of Agriculture.
I think that last one is not going to go anywhere because the Vincentians are requiring that we prove that the cattle to be exported would not have suffered from tuberculosis, or what's the other cattle-specific, I don't remember the name, and certainly rabies for the last 5 years. No, that's an impossibility. So our minister, we can certify that whatever we send now is completely free from any disease, but we can't say that nothing happened. We can't go back 5 years and say that there was never any problem. And I quite frankly do not understand the practicalities or impracticalities of that sort of a request. But our minister was to get back in touch with the Vincentian minister to see if that can be worked out. But if that will continue to be the conditionality, that's not going to go anywhere. In terms of Mexico, I'd spoken to the Mexican ambassador to ask him to transmit some request for there to be some waiver or reduction of the tariff. And he came back to say that that's not looking very likely. From what our minister tells me, it may be that even with the tariff, some limited export of cattle from Belize into Mexico is still possible. And so that is being worked on. With Guatemala, another reason why we thought we would relent and take the chance in allowing the corn people to go all the way to Spanish Lookout is because it does seem as though there is some movement, and we wouldn't have wanted to stop it, in terms of the effort to begin now a formal legal trade in cattle between Belize and Guatemala. The local Belize Livestock Producers Association had already gotten together with Barrow. There had been exchanges with the counterparts in Guatemala, and it appears as though movement is taking place in that regard.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Kami. We'll now move on to Mr. Tony Jimenez from Belize Times. Tony, are you there? Tony, can you unmute your mic, please?
Am I on now? Hello, good afternoon, Prime Minister. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi, sir. I want to get directly at it. A slight point of clarification or some information here. The UDP representatives that are not ministers, did they participate in not withholding their salaries?
What do you mean? If you're not ministers, what salaries do you get? You don't get any salaries.
Do they get a stipend?
Sir, are you talking about what we call standard bearers?
No. What UDP representatives. There are a couple of UDP representatives that are not ministers.
And John Saldiva, who are no longer ministers or ministers of state.
Right.
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, they were obliged to give up their the month's salary. I don't know that they get housing allowance. I believe the answer is no, that they don't. So they can't give up what they don't get.
Right. Okay. On another note, you mentioned earlier on a budget that might be reread, or I guess we need to go to the House again. Is there a timeline for that?
Not yet. I'm thinking that after we see how the collections go for the first quarter, or certainly the first 4 months, because again, the budget that we read has been blown to pieces. We don't want to go and rebudget on a basis that might prove later on to be as unreal, depending on how long the crisis continues, as the first set of figures proved to be. So it's a nice bit of timing that will have to be engaged in. I would say after the end of the first quarter, but how quickly after the end of the first quarter, I don't want to hazard a guess right now.
Okay. Going into the meeting with the PSU and the BNTU, was there disclosure during the meeting? Sorry, I'm asking for details, I guess. Was there disclosure during the meeting of the list of contract officers? And
it's not, no, contract officers, no, that did not form part of the agenda, no.
Okay. I'm asking because you did allude to providing the list a couple of press conferences ago. Yeah.
I'm not saying I didn't, but I don't remember. But if I did, I'm sure that I would have done so. Absolutely, as I always am, prepared to deliver on any commitment that I make.
Okay. Sir, on this morning on Facebook, there's a picture that's going around of a cattle, I don't want to call it a ranch, but that hovers directly over the border. I had had asked before on how prepared is Belize to man its borders, including all, which brings in Guatemalan incursions. Are you apprised of that picture? Is it real?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay, but it's there, and there are, as we like to say that it's going all over Facebook, but it's just a concern because
Accurate.
again,
Not quite to the contrary. But I let me not get involved any further. I simply don't know of that, and I can't. I don't know if you're saying the ranch straddles the border.
Right.
I'm not. But let me. I don't know, sir. So let me not pursue that. I don't know.
yes, yeah. Quickly, because I know that we're working with time here. I noticed that you don't have on the mask again. Is there any relaxing of that measure?
I don't have on the mask.
That everybody will everybody still be asked going forward to wear the mask in public and so on?
Sir, so I came to the office and had to be in public with my mask. I took off the mask for purposes of speaking to you because it's a little bit of a hindrance, and everybody else in the room has on a mask. So please don't misinterpret the fact that I'm not wearing it. It's just because I'm protected since everybody else is wearing one. And I certainly, once I leave the building and I'm going out into the open, I will always wear my mask unless that particular requirement changes. And that requirement has not changed. You can, as we said, you can go swim, but you wear your mask when you're on your way to wherever you're going. When you get there, of course, you cannot swim with your mask. And when you're exercising in the morning, you can take it off. But generally, to be wearing the masks in public spaces, that restriction has not been relaxed.
Yes, sir. A closing question or commentary from you, sir. The bipartisan effort on the oversight committee. Would you qualify its ongoings as successful?
Well, first of all, it's not just a bipartisan effort, you know. Remember that the Oversight Committee is chaired in a bipartisan way, but the committee comprises membership, apart from myself and the leader of the opposition as co-chairs. The membership is the Belize Council of Churches, the National Trade Union Congress of Belize, the Belize National NGO Network. Who else, Audrey? Who am I missing? All the social partners, the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Very, very important indeed. So it would be, I think, inaccurate and perhaps insulting to the other members if we simply characterized it as a bipartisan effort. But as a group effort, as a partnership effort involving government, opposition, and the social partners, I would say, sir, that it is going absolutely splendidly. And I'm happy that you ask. It gives me a chance to thank the members of that National Oversight Committee and to say to you and the country that the contributions that they make individually and therefore ultimately collectively are absolutely outstanding. It's one of the best things that I ever did. The circumstances called for it, but there are not too many examples of this sort of approach in the rest of our Caribbean states. Governments seem to think, and maybe they are succeeding, that they can handle this kind of a tragedy on their own. It always struck me from the very beginning that it's the right thing to do, and that for my own sake, that I would need the help that for government that in fact has materialized. That committee has done, I repeat, an absolutely invaluable job, and I think the entire country, the entire country owes them a huge debt of gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. We have two final members of the media left to ask questions. We'll go with Aaron Humes. We'll go with Aaron, and then we'll wrap up with Leticia. Yes, Aaron. Aaron, I'll remind you that we are in a bit of a time crunch, and I'm sure a lot of questions have been answered. I just want to remind you we are in a bit of a time crunch, so if you would proceed with that in mind. Thank you.
I think no more than 4 questions, certainly, because quite a few of mine have been answered already, no? Are we on? Are we on, guys? Guys, are we on?
Yes, Aaron, go ahead.
Okay. So Aaron Humes from Breaking Belize News. Thanks for having us, Prime Minister. In terms of the bond holders, you mentioned that you don't want to tip them off as to what our plans are, but can you say when do you plan to engage them on the question of a deferral and or consent solicitation, changes to the consent solicitation for the super bond?
But who says I'm going to engage them on any deferral? You were trying to get me to do exactly what I said that I would do. Anyway, sir, discussions. I would not seek to provoke any discussions with the bondholders until it is absolutely necessary. The payment is due in August. I don't see any discussion before the end of July. I hope that's satisfactory.
Okay. Then next, in terms of transfers of public officers, that's scheduled for August, and like what's going on with our budget issues, will it go through? Because that necessitates a payment of some $1,200 for each person being transferred.
It's not been adverted to yet, but I shouldn't think so. In the circumstances, I think that would be unduly disruptive. So I don't think so.
Okay. In terms of the, you mentioned the issue of the foreign reserves that were below or at the 3-month limit for import cover. How long ago was that? Can you say? And will that interfere with any of our U.S. dollar obligations?
No, because remember that the real whopper in terms of foreign exchange debt service obligations is the super bond. We do service bilateral and multilateral debt, and so those two are would represent some kind of call on our foreign reserves. But two things. Remember that we expect to get in a fair amount of money from the IFIs, and once those come, the quantum would more than offset the debt service obligations over the next fiscal year. Sorry.
It's fully on. I just want to fit now with the cool, make it cool.
There's some, Aaron, I don't know if there's something wrong. There's something wrong. Somebody's talking over us, Aaron.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think the other person's mic has now been muted. Yeah, I was saying so. I don't see a problem in terms of the other non-commercial, the other bilateral or multilateral debt servicing obligations. I insist that the flows that are to come from the IFIs will more than make up for the inflows, will more than make up for whatever outflows there are. Remember, these are all at concessionary terms. So the big problem is the super bond, and we already indicated we will deal with that. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We are also seeking from the International Monetary Fund some balance of payments loan, and so again that would mean an inflow of foreign exchange. We're not in the best possible place, but we are managing to limp along, and just from the foreign exchange point of view, we ought to be doing better once these flows from the IFIs start to come. That's another reason why we impress upon them that there's this need for speed. We want those monies to come before we have to face the particular crunch that will be represented by the fact that there are certain essential imports that must be financed. We've certainly got to pay CFE for electricity. That's in foreign currency. I think we pay Fortis. I don't know how much we're getting in terms of electricity from them, but we pay foreign currency there as well. So there are the continuing foreign currency obligations, and at some point we are going to, if things continue as they are, face a crisis. That's another instance in which tourism is all important, because that's, as everybody knows, our largest foreign exchange earner. But I don't foresee any collapse. I don't foresee any pressures that would cause the peg to slip anytime soon. Not at all.
Okay, three very short final questions then. First, the unemployment relief program. We got word this week that some of the individuals who were getting the debit cards were told that they have trouble accessing the PIN numbers that you to use with the card. Can that be addressed?
About that, but if that is so, I'm sure it is being addressed.
Okay, then next, going back to that issue with the truckers and the resumption of trade at the western border, is the accompaniment of a customs guard something that will be applied across the board? So not just to the Guatemalans, but I presume to Belizeans as well.
In the normal course, if you're bringing in something from the border without paying duty or taking it to a bonded warehouse or so, you have to have a customs guard accompany you. But in the normal, this is a peculiar situation. This is having the custom guard accompany people who are not bringing in any goods, but who are going to load goods to take out. So it's a special set of circumstances.
And then the very last question. This week we have been following this whole issue of liquefied petroleum gas and the start of operations by the National Gas Company. Let me ask, has Cabinet given, as I think the National Company said, permission to start operations? Because I think they've made one sale so far to B&E yesterday. But in terms of dealing with the farmer importers, Gastomsa and BUL and others, they were, I think, still waiting on the government to say, yes, you can go forward, because Zeta, I believe, is out of gas. And then two, we saw the release of prices by the Bureau of Standards, and there is a slight increase from the last time. Can you speak to what factors into that?
As far as I know, sorry, again, we're having some feedback, but the green light has been given to the National Gas Company, and so they are just starting, but will, of course, expand their distribution network as quickly as possible. In terms of the prices, the new pricing structure, as far as I have been told, does include some small increase in the wholesale price. Presumably that's going to find its way down to the consumer, but I am not sure what the end result is going to be. So let me hold my fire until the picture becomes clearer.
We have one final set of questions. Leticia Guerra from Vibes Media. Go ahead, Leticia.
Good afternoon, PM. A number of people have been complaining on social media and over airwaves that they have received one COVID-19 financial assistance payment and that's it. Are you aware of this?
No, I'm not. I know that, like the course of true love, the payment of unemployment relief never would run completely smooth. So I know that from time to time, people do say that their payments are arriving late, or in some cases, payments have not arrived at all. Dr. Barnett, whenever I hear from people, whenever I get complaints, and whenever other ministers certainly get complaints, those are channeled to Dr. Barnett, and an effort is made to deal with the complaints. I can't put it any higher than that. It is clear that the system is not perfect, foolproof. And also remember, there is the issue of people applying and simply not getting approval because there are mistakes made in the data they submit, or they, in plain fact, don't properly qualify. But to the extent that there is some slippage regarding those who clearly qualify, I would not doubt that. All I would say further is that, again, we will continue, and everybody must, not just myself or ministers, these omissions, these gaps must be brought to the attention of either of the two economic czars so that the remedial steps can immediately be embarked upon.
Repeat that, please, Leticia. Unmute your mic.
We're not hearing you.
Will there be any consideration of reopening the COVID-19 financial assistance application program? Since a lot of businesses were already operating in the red, and now with COVID-19, they might not be able to recover from this. More people will be losing their jobs. Will there be any consideration?
Well, we've said that there will be such consideration, but already we received over 80,000 applications, and I think what's happening now is that there is a lot of bureaucracy. Well, that's not the right word. There's a lot of perhaps unnecessary work that has to be done because towards the end it was obvious, according to those who are in charge of the process, that people were trying to run some red lights. But as soon as that is sorted out and we can see where we are in terms of the final number of persons legitimately on the program, then it will be time to see if we invite further applications. That will have to depend on what the circumstances are at that time. I repeat that with this COVID-19, you're dealing with a hell of a moving target. I don't think I can therefore speak with any more certainty than I just did. Absolutely, we are, and have already said that there is a preparedness to reopen the application process. Not immediately. We must first deal with the 80,000 and ensure that that list has been pruned, and then we see where we are.
My apologies. Possibly the largest challenge we now face, besides any second or third wave may be coming, is to build back our economy, and in doing so, reduce unemployment and earn much needed foreign exchange. One area in which millions are presently being invested is in road projects such as the Caracol Road, Coastal Road, Airport Link Road, and Sartaneja Road. Altogether, over $450 million. Are there any plans to stop these projects and redirect the funds on unemployment and food relief and rebuilding the economy?
No, you can't talk about stopping projects that are already ongoing. You're going to get yourself into all sorts of contractual and legal trouble. That's number one. But let's take, for example, and also public works. Since when did public works become a bad word? We talk about the Great Depression. We talk about when unemployment was at its height historically in the US. That's when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with the New Deal, you know. And you know what the New Deal was based upon in terms of trying to deal with unemployment? Public works. That was the centerpiece of the New Deal. So nobody can ever tell me that monies spent on public works do not represent economic stimulus and the creation of jobs. But to get back to what I was saying, you simply can't throw contracts through the window. But take, for example, the Caracol Road. There is, in terms of, that's to be done in phases. There is a contract already signed and in progress with respect to phase 1. Phase 2, there was bidding and there was a successful bid, but the contract for the start of the works has not yet been signed. Now, you might have a case to make in terms of saying, well, perhaps government will have to ask for a postponement of the start of works for phase 2. Because two things, remember that by and large also, when you and forgive me for, I don't want to jump all over the place, but it just struck me that I should point out another hole in your argument. When it comes to these public works, they are foreign funded, you know. So when you talk about reallocating funds for unemployment relief, our unemployment relief program is being funded by our borrowings from the central bank. These public works programs are being funded, in the case of the Sartaneja Road, by Taiwan. That's foreign exchange coming into the country, into the economy. We just talked about the need for us to try to boost foreign exchange in view of what is happening. And likewise with Caracol. The only downside is that, of course, all these projects require a degree of counterpart funding. So there is no way we're going to stop in terms of Caracol what is already ongoing, phase 1 of the construction of the road, which continues to attract foreign monies, foreign exchange. In terms of phase 2, we have to stop and think, because while we would dearly want the additional foreign monies that will be coming in to pay the contractor for the works encompassed in phase 2, government would have to find the counterpart funding. We really have to look at where things are in terms of the revenue collapse and see if indeed we would not be obliged to ask for a postponement of phase 2 simply because it will be difficult, if not impossible, for us to find the counterpart funding for that, for the works there to commence.
Okay, and just following from that previous question, we're grateful for the invaluable assistance from Taiwan that they have provided over the many years. Their last loan already approved to us was for $100 million for the Sartaneja Road, offered on favorable terms. Would it not be more likely that our Taiwanese friends would repurpose this loan to help us build our country for use in helping our poor and suffering people and in the tourism sector probably?
Loan funded a contract that they gave to one of their major companies. Normally, remember that when we borrow for public works, we choose the contractors. That Taiwanese loan came with that particular conditionality, that the work would have to be done by this huge company that they have. They've now formed a local subsidiary of it, but it was established and doing business, which is what caused us to go to the Taiwanese. They were doing business in Guatemala, building there was a huge road project in Guatemala, and we went and said, well, what about us? But that's not monies that can be repurposed. That's not monies that can be taken away from that Taiwanese company that didn't win a contract, was given the contract as part of the loan conditions. They're not going to do that. They would get into trouble at home, legally and politically, so that one is out of the question. Where we can repurpose, as we're doing with the IDB in terms of the 6.2 million for health, and the World Bank in terms of the QUIP funding of $21 million, we do so. But I'm afraid that's absolutely not going to be possible in the case of the Sartaneja Road. I'm not too sure that the people from Sartaneja would appreciate, if we could do it, that we ought to do it. But it doesn't matter. It's academic because it can't be done.
And one final question from me. Can you provide clarity on the butane price increase? Is the new price for supply now brought in by NGCL? And if they're shipping rather than trucking it in, shouldn't the price have gone down?
I just answered your colleague earlier to say that what I've been told by the minister responsible is that there is a small increase in the wholesale price. I expect that that would result in as well a small increase in the consumer price, but not necessarily. It's a matter now of the margin of the retailer and whether the margin of the retailer would be reduced a little bit from what it is so that the final price to the consumer remains the same. But I am not really sure how it will all shake out. I am positive, though, that the Minister of Trade would be more than willing to entertain further questions on this matter from you or from any other member of the media.
Very much, Letitia. Thank you, Prime Minister. That concludes our virtual press conference for today. I want to thank you very much, Right Honorable Prime Minister, members of the media, and viewers far and near. Also, please keep in mind and remember that today at 3 p.m. on the Government of Belize Press Office page, the Attorney General will give a detailed explanation of the new measures enacted in accordance with the state of emergency. Thank you very much. Have a very nice day.
Thank you all. Thank you.